Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. Now, you've probably never heard of the British-Iranian War of 1856-57, but it's shaping Middle Eastern geopolitics right now in 2025. This forgotten Victorian campaign, the Anglo-Persian War, when British redcoats fought Iranian forces, wasn't about territory or oil, but part of the 19th century strategic Great Game between Russia and Britain. However, it created a deep-rooted Iranian mistrust of Britain and the West that still drives Tehran's foreign policy today. Now, before we dive into the story, I just want to clear up some confusion, as I've talked about Persia and Iran. Well, they're the same country. To Europeans in the 1850s, it was always Persia, derived from the ancient Greek name for the region. But locals always called it Iran, meaning land of the Aryans. And in 1935, the government in Tehran officially requested foreign countries to use Iran. But for our Victorian story, as the British called it Persia at the time, I will tend to use that, but will also refer to Iran from time to time. Our story begins in the context of the Great Game, that grand strategic rivalry between the British and the Russian empires that played out across Central Asia throughout the 19th century. Britain's primary concern was protecting the jewel in their imperial crown, India, and every Russian advance southward through the Caucasus and Central Asia was seen through the lens of potential threat to the subcontinent. The British had nightmares about Cossack cavalry charging through the Khyber Pass, and they were determined to maintain a buffer zone of friendly, or at least neutral states between Russian territory and British India. Russia, meanwhile, had been steadily expanding its influence into Persia through the early 19th century. Following wars of expansion, they had acquired significant territorial concessions in the Caucasus, following the Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828. And these weren't minor border adjustments. Russia had gained control of what is now Armenia, Azerbaijan and parts of Georgia, along with exclusive navigation rights on the Caspian Sea. So you can see why the British were getting twitchy. The Persians, or the Iranians, found themselves in an impossible position. Caught between two expanding empires, they tried to play both sides. But this delicate balancing act was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The Shah's court was riddled with factions, some pro-Russian, others pro-British, and many simply trying to preserve Persian independence in an increasingly hostile world. The flashpoint for the British war with the Iranians was the city of Herat in western Afghanistan. In the 1850s, it was considered one of the most strategically important places in Central Asia. Known as the Key to India, or Gateway to India, Herat commanded the routes between Persia, Central Asian cities such as Bukhara, Afghanistan, and the Indian subcontinent. Historically, the city had been part of the great Persian empires, but by the 18th century, it had fallen under Afghan control as they built their own competing empire. Persian rulers, however, had never abandoned their claims to what they considered historically Persian territory. The Shah of Persia, or Iran, Nasser al-Din, in the 1850s saw the reconquest of Herat as both a matter of national honour and as a way of compensating for those territories lost to the Russians in the Caucasus. But the British saw things very differently. To them, Herat was the forward defensive position protecting the approaches to India. If Herat fell to Persia, and Persia was under Russian influence, then Russian power would be within striking distance of British India. And thus the British were determined that Herat should remain under Afghan control, where they believed they could better manage the strategic situation. They had previously thwarted Persian efforts to re-establish control over the city, but in 1854, during a period of internal instability in Afghanistan, the Shah saw his chance and his forces occupied the city. At the beginning of the 19th century, British-Iranian relations had been cordial. The two sides had even signed a treaty in which Britain offered to support Persia if ever her territorial integrity was threatened by another power. And we all know which power they were both thinking of. So, when the Russians invaded Persian territory in the 1830s, the Shah in Tehran felt mightily let down when the British refused to actually come to his aid. Believing the British were looking after their own interests, relations between the two countries began to cool. At exactly the same time, due to the treaties the Russians forced the Iranians to sign, they started to gain more and more influence in the country, fueling British concerns that Persia was coming under Russian control. And as if the British paranoia about the Russian bear and the Persian grab of Herat wasn't bad enough, the situation took a further turn for worse in Tehran itself. The British mission in Tehran, led by Charles Murray, a diplomat who seemed not to be very diplomatic, was increasing the rift between the two countries. In October 1856, matters came to a head when the British diplomatic mission was actually attacked by a Persian mob, apparently with at least the tacit approval of some government officials. The British government, led by Lord Palmerston, saw this as the final straw. Not only had the Persians grabbed Herat against British interests, but now they had, well, certainly allowed a mob to attack a British diplomatic embassy. As the man who coined the term gunboat diplomacy, Palmerston was not going to let matters rest. The stage was set for military action. And on the 1st of November 1856, after the Iranians had refused to leave Herat, the British declared war. Unlike many colonial conflicts of the 19th century, Britain had no intention of conquering Persian territory or overthrowing the Persian government. Their war aims were remarkably limited and specific. First and foremost, a Persian withdrawal from Herat and renouncing of all claims to Afghan territory. Second, compensation for the attack on their diplomatic mission and guarantees for the future safety of British representatives. And thirdly, they wanted Persia to sign a new treaty that would clarify the relationship between the two countries and prevent future conflicts. Notably, this war had absolutely nothing to do with oil. Commercial oil extraction from Persia didn't begin until 1908, more than 50 years after our story. And thus, the British weren't fighting for petroleum in the Middle East. They were fighting for strategic position in the great game against Russia. The British strategy was to strike at Persian positions along the Persian Gulf coast, where their naval superiority would give them a decisive advantage. The aim was to bring the Persians or Iranians to the negotiating table with a show of strength. Ring any bells? A fleet under Rear Admiral Sir Henry Leake, the 67-year-old commander of the Indian Navy, set sail for the Persian Gulf, arriving off the port of Bushehr at the end of November. Once his whole fleet arrived, British landings began on December the 9th, 1856. The British, and when I say that I mean principally British Indian forces, under the command of Major General Stalker, disembarked under the cover of naval gunfire. In their eagerness to engage with the Persian defences, several of the Royal Navy vessels sailed too close to shore and were stranded on the turning tide. Fortunately for them, they were beyond the range of the defenders' guns. Bushehr was defended by approximately 3,000 Persian troops, under the command of Shoj al-Mulk, a competent Persian general who had done his very best to prepare the city's defences. Under the cover of the naval bombardment, the British army advanced on the fortified bastions. The leading assault party consisted of the 20th Bombay Native Infantry. Leading from the front, their 38-year-old captain, John Augustus Wood, climbed up onto the parapet of the defences. Despite the Scot being hit by 7 musket balls, he charged the Persians, killing an officer before the rest of his men joined him. For that act of bravery, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. The VC had only been inaugurated by Queen Victoria in January of that year, at the back end of the Crimean War. 111 men were to receive the award for actions during that war. Wood's VC, however, was the first outside of the Crimean campaign. It was also the first awarded to someone serving in an Indian regiment. It's now held by the 20th Bombay Native Infantry's successor, the 2nd Rajputana Regiment in the modern Indian Army. Despite a brave resistance, Bushehr swiftly fell, with the Persian garrison retreating inland, but in good order. However, the British now decided that a stronger force was needed to impress upon the Persians the seriousness of Britain's intentions, rather than simply occupying a port. The man chosen to lead this new enlarged army was 54-year-old General Sir James Outram. The son of a Derbyshire engineer, Outram had been brought up in Scotland before securing a cadetship in the East Indian Army when he was 16. A renowned big game hunter, he'd killed 191 tigers in a 10-year period. He was also a highly regarded soldier in India. Known as the Bayard of India after the famous French knight, Outram had captured an Afghan battle standard during the First Anglo-Afghan War in the 1840s, before fighting in several further wars in India. Apart from his courage and tactical skills, he was also known for his humanitarian approach to warfare. It was possibly this last quality that earned him his appointment for the Persian campaign. What the British needed was a commander who could win and convince the Shah to come to the negotiating table without destroying their army or the regime. Either of those two options could well play into the Russians' hands, and Cossacks might be in Herat a lot sooner than the British feared. His army consisted of two divisions, one commanded by Stalker and the other by Sir Henry Havelock, who would later achieve considerable fame in the Indian Mutiny. Outram now planned to advance inland from Bushehr to both demonstrate British capability and put additional pressure on the Persian government. His objective was Borazjan, a town about 46 miles northeast of Bushehr that controlled the inland trade routes, and which, Outram's scouts informed him, was being fortified by the Persians. Leaving a force of about 1,800 to protect the port, he set off inland with an army of about 4,600 infantry and cavalry and 18 guns. His force included two British regiments, the 64th and 78th Regiments of Foot, who would later become the North Staffordshire Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders respectively. Along with them were the 2nd European Bombay Regiment and two regiments of Bombay Native Infantry. Alongside them rode his Indian cavalry, including the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry, and more about them in a little while. The British set out on the 3rd of February 1857. Outram determined to move with speed, and hence, apart from his weapons, each man carried a greatcoat, a blanket, and 2 days' provisions. They would have no tents to sleep in. For the next 41 hours, he forced-marched his men through a deluge of torrential rain and bitterly cold nights. 2 days later, they arrived at Borazjan to find it abandoned. The Persian defenders had left behind large quantities of stores and ammunition, which the British found were already being looted by local inhabitants. Blowing the Persian magazine containing 40,000 pounds of gunpowder sky high and seizing all the food supplies of the Persian army, the British commander was satisfied that he'd crippled Persian military capabilities in the region and commenced the return journey to the coast on the 7th. However, the Iranian commander had not fled to the hills. He had carefully prepared a trap for Outram. That evening, his cavalry attacked the British column, forcing Outram to take a defensive position through the rest of the night near the village of Khoshab. As dawn broke, the British general found 7,000 soldiers of the Persian army drawn up, ready for battle. They included over 900 men from the Kashar regiment, the Shah's personal bodyguard, who wore British-style uniforms consisting of red tunics and white trousers. 8 other regiments, including an Arab regiment, plus cavalry, made up the rest of the Iranian commander's 4,200 fully trained and experienced troops. Many of them were armed and trained by Europeans, most notably the Russians, yet another cause of concern for the British. And they were joined by 7,000 irregular cavalry, who, whilst numerically strong, were armed with traditional weapons. Outram deployed his forces, with the 64th and 78th Highlanders forming the main assault, supported by the Bombay Native Infantry and artillery. The battle raged for approximately 4 hours, with the Persians putting up a determined resistance from their hilltop positions. The turning point came when Outram ordered a cavalry charge by the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry against the Persian left flank. As the Indian horsemen swept forward, the Persians, true to their European training, formed squares to repel the attack. An anonymous officer, writing in an Indian newspaper, the Bombay Telegraph, gave a first-hand account of the charge. As they approached, Forbes, the commander, was shot through the thigh, but unheeding, they swept onward. Daunted by the flashes and the fire and the noise and crackle of the musketry, Lieutenant Moore's horse swerved as they came up. Dropping his sword from his left hand and letting it hang by the nut at his wrist, he caught up the rein in both hands, screwed his horse's head straight, and then coolly, as if riding at a fence, let him at the square. The horse fell stone dead upon the bayonets, crushing the rider beneath him and breaking his sword. Managing to struggle out from under the dead horse, the 26-year-old Irishman, Lieutenant Moore, now found himself surrounded by the enemy. Seeing his peril, another officer, Lieutenant John Malcolmson, rode into the broken square, and taking his foot out of a stirrup so that Moore could place his foot into the space, together they rode to safety. For that action, both men were awarded the Victoria Cross. Moore's initial jump at the square had broken its formation, and now the rest of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry poured through, slashing at the Iranian troops, and then rode right through the square and out the other side. Now they turned and charged back. The anonymous officer, in his letter to the Bombay Telegraph, claimed that of the 500 Iranian soldiers who composed that square, only 20 escaped to tell the tale of its destruction. The shock of seeing a square destroyed by enemy cavalry demoralised the other Persian defenders. Meanwhile, the Poona Irregular Horse captured the standard of one of the regiments. The standard pole was topped by a 900-year-old silver hand, engraved with the words, "The hand of God is above all things." That silver hand remains the insignia of the Poona horse in the modern Indian army. The Persian forces, despite fighting courageously, could not withstand the coordinated British assault, combined with that devastating cavalry charge. Their resistance collapsed, and their army retreated in disorder. By 10 a.m, the Battle of Khoshab was over. British casualties were remarkably light, 12 killed and 42 wounded, whilst Persian losses were estimated at over 500 killed and wounded, with many more scattered in the retreat. That night, Outram marched his men a further 20 miles through more torrential rain, arriving back at Bushehr around midnight. In the previous 5 days, they had marched 90 miles in appalling weather and fought a successful battle. It was a truly impressive achievement, and one that should be remembered far more than it actually is. Outram now decided to pressurise the Iranians further up the coastline, close to the border with modern-day Iraq. The most significant of these actions was the attack on Mohammare, modern-day Khorram Shah, a strategic port city controlling access to the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The town was defended by 13,000 Persian regular troops and also Arab irregulars loyal to the local sheikh. The fortifications were more substantial than those at Bushehr, with earthworks up to 20 feet in height and manned by 30 guns. In the early hours of the 26th of March 1857, his warships opened fire on the Iranian batteries. Within 2 hours, most of them had been silenced, and at 9 a.m. he landed his infantry. As the British advanced through the date groves towards the defences, the Persians blew up their largest magazine and retreated. But the battle had no impact on the course of the war, because after the British victory at Khoshab, it had become clear to the Persian government that continued military resistance was futile. Their armies had been no match for the highly disciplined, determined and well-led British. Furthermore, they were on their own. The only power capable of helping them defeat the British were the Russians, and any such help from them would come at a hefty price. Better for the Shah to cut his losses. He and his advisers concluded that negotiation was preferable to continued warfare. The Treaty of Paris, signed on the 4th of March 1857, officially ended the Anglo-Persian War. As ever in those days, when messages were carried by sailing ship, it had taken 3 weeks for the news to reach General Outram, so that last battle need not have been fought. The terms of the treaty were relatively moderate, reflecting Britain's war aims that had always been quite limited. Persia agreed to withdraw from Herat and renounce all claims to Afghan territory. They also agreed to pay an indemnity for the attack on the British mission and to provide guarantees for the future safety of British diplomatic personnel. Importantly, the treaty did not involve any territorial concessions by Persia to Britain. It was a classic piece of gunboat diplomacy, and then it swiftly moved into the shadows. Why? British rule in India was under threat. The Indian Mutiny, or Great Revolt, broke out in April 1857. Ironically, the greatest threat to the British Raj came not from the Russians pouring through Persia, but from her own rebelling sepoys. General Outram and his men returned to the subcontinent, where he would achieve fame during the siege at Lucknow. Eventually retiring to England, he died in 1863. In the decades that followed, Shah Nasser al-Din would enjoy cordial relations with Britain, visiting London several times before his assassination in 1896. For the rest of the 19th century, Britain continued to view Persia as a crucial buffer state in the Great Game, leading to ongoing interference in Persian internal affairs. Meanwhile, Russia never abandoned its ambitions in Persia either. In 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention divided Persia into spheres of influence, with Russia's sphere in the north and Britain's in the south. This agreement was made without any Persian consultation. During World War I, the British and Russians operated on Persian soil against the Ottoman Empire, despite Persia's declared neutrality. These interventions, whilst justified by the powers involved as military necessities, were seen by many Iranians as continued violations of their sovereignty. The discovery of oil in 1908 added a new dimension to British interests, leading to the famous or infamous Anglo-Persian Oil Company concession that would dominate Persian politics for decades to come. That source of oil would create further interventions by both the UK during the Second World War and then also by the USA during the Cold War. So, when we look at modern Iran's suspicion of foreign intervention and resistance to international pressure, we can trace these attitudes back to experiences like the Anglo-Persian War. The Iranian government's rhetoric about foreign interference isn't just political posturing, it's rooted in historical experience of repeated violations of sovereignty. The forgotten war of 1856-57 reminds us that military victories can have consequences extending far beyond their immediate scope, and that history can cast a very long shadow, right down to the present day. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. Check out my other episodes on forgotten conflicts such as the Zulu War, the Indian Mutiny, the Opium Wars in China, and the wars against the Mahdists in Sudan. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.